let's move on to a completely different type of clustering approach, right? Density-based. The idea here is that when we talk about a cluster, okay, clusters can be thought of as dense regions, right? As when you look at, for example, let's look at the plot that you have there. You have blue points, red points, and yellow points, right? So, in general, these clusters seem obvious because, in fact, they are highly dense, right? I mean, you have a lot of points that are together, so it makes sense, right? So that's the definition or the intuition behind density-based clustering, right? If points are very close by, I mean, if they are close to each other in a what appears to be a highly dense area, then that's probably a cluster in itself, right? The interesting thing about density-based clustering is that as opposed to, for example, partitioning methods, these work really well when we have any type of like arbitrary shapes for the clusters. The most common methods, I mean, and the one that we're going to be looking into is DB-scan. There's another one that performs slightly better, which is called optics. But I think that DB-scan is a good starting point. If you're interested, do some research on optics. I'll mention a little bit at the end exactly what's the difference between the two. But before explaining DB-scan and how it works and how it clusters, I think that it's important to cover some basic definitions regarding density and points being together to each other and so on. So the first definition that we're going to be looking into is the epsilon neighborhood. Okay, so if we are considering the epsilon neighborhood of a point P, that neighborhood is set up of all the points whose distance is smaller than epsilon. Okay, so any point whose distance with respect to P is smaller than epsilon, that's part of the epsilon neighborhood of P. We define as high density an epsilon neighborhood that contains at least a minimum number of points. Okay, so if you look at the plot that I'm showing there, the epsilon neighborhood of P is the circle surrounding P that has the epsilon value as radius. The epsilon neighborhood of Q is the circle surrounding Q that has as radius again the epsilon value. Now if we define a high density area as having at least 4 points, you'll see that the density of P is high because it has 4 points within the epsilon neighborhood, but the density of Q is low because it does not have 4 points within the epsilon neighborhood. Other important definitions for the DB-scan algorithm and for any density-based algorithm are core, border, and outlier points. Okay? Given the epsilon neighborhood of a point and the minimum number of points that we are considering to define a high-density area, we categorize objects into 3 different groups. A point is a core point if it has more than a specified number of minimum points within the epsilon neighborhood. Okay? So look at the plot there. You see, for example, the dot that is labeled as core. If you look at its epsilon neighborhood has 5 points, at least it has actually 6 points, okay? So, because that point has at least the minimum points specified within its epsilon neighborhood, we consider it to be a core point. Border points are points that have fewer than the minimum number of points within their epsilon neighborhoods, okay? But border points are in the neighborhood of a core point. So if you look at the point that I have labeled there as border, you'll see that the epsilon neighborhood of that point certainly does not have 5 points within its borders, within its limits, but that point is a borderline point or is in the neighborhood of a core point. And because it's in the neighborhood of a core point, then it's considered a border point. And then finally, the outlier or the noise points are points that are not core points, neither border points. Okay? This is really important. So we have to make sure that we understand what's the epsilon neighborhood. We understand that a point is high density when it has a minimum number of points within its epsilon neighborhood. A core point is a point that has more than the minimum number of points within its epsilon neighborhood. A border point is a point that it's not core, but it's in the neighborhood of a core point. And an outlier or a noise point is just something that it's not core or border. If we look at a set of data points, like the original data points on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, what I'm showing is what the core points are, the border points in blue, the core in green, and the outliers in red. This is for an epsilon neighborhood of 10 and the minimum number of points of 4. So as you can see there, the green points, the core points, are the ones that are probably defining the clusters. The blue points are borderline, they could be part of the cluster or not, and the outliers are, it's obvious that they are not part of the clusters. So as you can see, just the definitions that we made without even applying any type of technique, but just those definitions are actually differentiating points that are highly dense from other types of outliers or points that are not strongly identified with one high density area. So the DB-scan algorithm is fully based on density reachability. Okay, so what do we mean by being density reachable? An object is directly density reachable from another object if P is a core object and Q is in P's epsilon neighborhood. Okay, so look again at the plot that we have down there. Remember that P, we said P is a core point. Okay, in fact, you draw its epsilon neighborhood and it has 5 points, which is larger than the minimum number of points. So P is a core point, it's a core object, and we observe that Q is in P's epsilon neighborhood. Okay, so Q is a border point. But we also say that Q is directly density reachable from P. Okay, why? Again, because it's a border point of a core point. So the important thing also to remember, so to be density reachable means that it's a point that is in the neighborhood of a core point and is directly density reachable. However, P is not directly density reachable from Q. Okay, so density reachability is not symmetric because the point needs to be a core point. Okay, and one point can be density reachable without being a core point. That's the reason why it's not symmetric. And when we talk about density reachability, it can be either directly reachable or indirectly reachable, right? So for example, P is directly density reachable from P1, from P2, and P2 is directly density reachable from P1 and P1 from Q. So we have there a chain in such a way that we can say that P is indirectly density reachable from Q. But we cannot say the opposite, again, because density reachability is not symmetric. So if we understand what density reachability means, the DB-scan algorithm is pretty straightforward. What the DB-scan algorithm does is that for each object that we have in our database, if the object is not classified, then what we do is to look whether the object is a core object. Okay, if it's a core object, we collect all the objects that are density reachable from that core object, and we assign them to a cluster. If the point is not a core object, then we say that it's noise. Obviously, in order to look for the core objects and to see whether they are density reachable or not, we need to define an epsilon and the minimum number of points. Those are the two parameters that we need to define in DB-scan. As I was saying before, there's another algorithm, the optics algorithm, that basically does not require the definition of epsilon, only the minimum number of points. But still, it requires a parameter. As usual, the most complicated thing with clustering approaches is how do we define those parameters? How do we find the best K? How do we find the cutting line in the dendrogram? How do we find the best epsilon and minimum number of points? And in general, the response is exactly the same thing. You have to try with different values and see which one is giving you a better accuracy if you have labels, a better Davis-Baldwin index, or whatever measure you're using to understand the quality of your clustering results. So in the example that I'm showing here, if you look at the points on the left-hand side, those points, like some of them are core objects because if you draw their epsilon neighborhood, they have at least those 3 points, and some of them are reachable from the core object, so that would be one cluster. This other point basically remains in itself because it's not a core object. It does not have, again, the minimum number of points within the epsilon neighborhood. And for the last set of points, again, we find there another cluster. Okay. Another interesting thing to remember is that dbScan in itself oftentimes is used as a clustering algorithm, but sometimes it's also used as a anomaly detection algorithm. So basically, or as an outlier detection algorithm, basically to detect points that are not clustered. So if you have, for example, a data set and you want to clean the data set, eliminate the outliers, sometimes you can apply dbScan, and the points that are not put in a cluster, you can consider them noise and basically eliminate from your dataset, and then start working with the dataset for whatever research question you want to answer. As I was saying, as in any type of clustering algorithm, determining epsilon and the minimum number of points is the toughest thing to do with a dbScan. And so the most common solution here, although not perfect, it's basically typically just try to plot the number of noise points that have the kth nearest neighbor at a farther distance. Okay, so what you have here, basically on the the intuition here is that, points that are within a cluster, their kth nearest neighbors are going to be roughly at the same distance, and that kth is going to define the minimum number of points, right? But the idea is that, you are within a cluster, so the minimum number of points are typically going to be at the same distance or at a similar distance. And so if you are a noise point, that noise point, the kth nearest neighbor is going to be farther away than, all the points that are within a cluster. So the plot that I'm showing here, basically on the x-axis, it has the points sorted according to the distance of the fourth nearest neighbor, and on the y-axis, you have the actual distance to the fourth nearest neighbor, right? And these type of plots are used basically just to look roughly at, what's the distance where the line breaks, okay? And where the line breaks is basically telling you whether you have noise points and clustering points, right? And typically, the way you decide, what's the k-value that you're going to use is whenever you use a k-value that basically has too many points as outliers, that's probably not good. Okay, so in this case, for example, the breaking line is around 2,800 samples approximately. So, you have like 200 points as outliers, it's not that bad. Okay, if your breaking point is at 1,000, that means that, almost 2,000 of your points could be outliers, which does not make any sense. So probably, that value for k is not the best one to choose. Okay, and in fact, this is the result of using dbScan. So as you can see, it can even capture the different shapes, and it's really resistant to noise. However, dbScan is not perfect as well, okay? So the main problem with dbScan is that, again, as we also mentioned for k-means, it does not handle well varying densities. Okay, so it handles well different shapes, but not varying densities. So you see here the original points, we have 6 different clusters, okay? Some of them are highly dense, some of them are not. On the right-hand side, you have the results of applying dbScan with different values for epsilon and minimum number of points, and none of them manages to fully capture the distribution of points.